this work for many years now, and we are very thankful for their support. Thank you all for joining us to celebrate the launch of Site by Site, an initiative of the CEQR Reform Coalition, including the Municipal Art Society, Regional Plan Association, and the NYU Garoni Center on Environmental, Energy, and Land Use Law. Tonight's event celebrates 3 years of work, the most recent product of which is a groundbreaking research on the citywide development sites over time to show how the city's environmental quality review process might be improved to estimate future development and evaluate impacts on city neighborhoods more reliably. For the one or two of you who doesn't live and breathe this stuff every day, I will just say that CEQR evaluations identify developable sites in rezonings. Based on these developable sites, impacts are estimated for the area, including things like traffic, open space, schools, residential displacement, among other factors. If those developable sites are estimated inaccurately, then the impacts of the development are also likely to be out of kilter as well. The impetus for this work goes back to MAS's 2018 report, Tale of Two Rezonings, which examined the shortcomings of development projections of Long Island City and downtown Brooklyn rezonings and the unintended consequences that they had for those neighborhoods. That study brought concerns about the identification of development sites to MAS's attention. This work also has an origin story in RPA's Inclusive City, also put out in 2018, which explored ways to improve civic engagement through the ULURP process. Within the coalition, NYU has done extensive research on improving mitigation procedures under CEQR and is poised to release a legal article on the feasibility of implementing impact fees to offset development in New York City. Site by Site is both unprecedented and timely, fitting well within the city's effort to examine CEQR processes under the recently released Get Stuff Built report. We will start the evening off with an overview of Site by Site and a demonstration of the web tool, followed by a panel discussion and Q&A with RPA, MAS, and Pratt Institute staff. And we'll end the evening with an opportunity for you to chat, mingle, and test out the web tool on the laptops that we've stationed around the venue. So I'd like to start off by introducing my colleague, Rana Zaman, MAS's project manager, who will now give a presentation on Site by Site. Welcome.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Rana, planner at MAS and a member of the Site by Site project team. We're so excited to be presenting this project to you. This particular project is a culmination of 18 months of collaboration and research between MAS, RPA, and our technical partner at Pratt Savvy. So Elizabeth touched on this a little bit. Before we get into it, I want to take a moment to run through what you can expect at this evening's program. So as you are all very well aware, planners love our specific terminology and acronyms, et cetera. So first up, we'll have some of those key terms that'll come out throughout the evening. And then I'll go through the site-by-site project, what we did, what we found, and what we think should come next. And then my colleague, Suzanne Goldberg, has also prepared a demonstration of the web tool to show you some of the features. And we'll hear from the site-by-site project team, and then we'll turn it over to you for questions, comments, and then we have some workstations set up, which you've seen, and you'll be able to explore the tool yourself. So, as Elizabeth mentioned, Site by Site's the latest initiative from the CEQR Reform Coalition. Since 2018, coalition members have produced research that examines ways to better equip decision makers, planners, and the public with accurate neighborhood-level information to improve engagement in land use decisions like rezonings. So let's get into it. What is that CEQR in the CEQR Reform Coalitions? As many of you very well know, it's a city environmental quality review. It's a mandatory disclosure process. Land use projects that require discretionary approvals by city agencies, like, for example, a proposal for a rezoning that changes the allowable density or uses in an area, have to go through CEQR. A proposal that triggers CEQR has to be evaluated for its environmental impacts. And in addition to the more obvious elements of environmental review, like you'll think of air quality and open space, are also things like community facilities, socioeconomic conditions, and neighborhood character. Ultimately, all of this results in an analysis of the reasonable worst-case development scenario. As the name suggests, this is a hypothetical development scenario for the project that results in the worst environmental consequences. The goal or intention of this framework is to account for a more comprehensive look at the full impact of a project's development on different things like traffic, school seats, greenhouse gases, and so on. So the graphics on this slide show a case from 960 Franklin Avenue in Brooklyn, where a project was being proposed for right by the Brooklyn Botanic Garden a couple years ago. On the left is the default scenario, or what could be built under current zoning. And then on the right is what could be built under the project proposal. Impact is assessed as the difference between the maximum consequences if the project never happened and everything is done as of right versus if the project is approved. Ooh, excuse me. All right, to recap. In order to identify environmental impacts in CEQR, we look at what are the worst environmental consequences of the project and compare them to the business as usual outcome or the no action. Highlighted here are the steps in the analysis, the specific step in the analysis rather, that is the focus of site by site. So when you're formulating the reasonable worst case development scenario, some of the things that are considered include known projects, growth factors, and what are called soft sites. And that is what we've lived and breathed for the last 18 months. Soft sites are sites where development is not currently anticipated, but which has characteristics that make development likely in the future. They might be empty lots or parking lots or buildings that don't maximize their height under current zoning. And in reality, as you can see in some of these pictures, sometimes the lots identified in the CEQR process do end up getting developed. Other times they may not, or development might actually happen somewhere that wasn't identified at all. As for why accurate soft site projections are important, with more reliable information about past estimates, future development can be rooted in actual trends so the impacts can be addressed more efficiently. Now, in order to identify, or better identify rather, how CEQR can be improved, we have to look at how it's going. And to that end, in Site by Site, what we did is simulate CEQR's soft site guidelines and then compare the results to what happened with development in real life for a course of 10 years from 2007 to 17. Our findings have been published in a report, which I see a lot of you have picked up because I think we're out, and a web tool that includes an interactive map where users can explore soft site data themselves. Okay, we're gonna get into methodology now, my favorite. All right, let's go. This is a table that summarizes how we interpreted the CEQR guidelines for soft sites using publicly available data. And this is just a summary of what we did generally. So on the left side, you have the CEQR guidance from the technical manual, which is the handbook that practitioners use. And in particular, the focus for us is the baseline criteria. So there's a baseline criteria for what is a soft site based on the size of a lot and its available FAR, or floor area ratio, which is a gross square footage of a building relative to the area of the lot that it sits on. Lots that are greater than 5,000 square feet and have substantially less than the maximum available FAR are the most developable. To put it in other words, large lots that are significantly underbuilt are considered the most likely to be developed. In addition to that, which is the first sort of level of screening, some sites don't qualify as soft sites by virtue of being generally difficult to relocate. And there are additional considerations in the realm of real estate, population trends, site-specific circumstances, in this analysis framework as well. On the right side is how we interpreted this information. So the technical manual leaves a lot of room for interpretation, especially in the case of additional considerations which are not quantified. And in these cases, we looked for variables in publicly available data that fit the CEQR fit under CEQR and might be more important for development trends, and made assumptions for data points that lack specificity. And for those familiar with data sets from the city, we primarily use Pluto in all its glory and everything else. For the initial screening, we looked at lots that were greater than or equal to 5,000 square feet, and for this definition of or interpretation of substantially less than the maximum level FAR, we used greater than or equal to 50% available based on several case studies of rezonings that we had looked at. But we also do recognize that in reality, applicants are advised to look at different thresholds based on their study area. Ultimately, I think this is more of a demonstration of how this process, this interpretation can vary from project to project. So we took 4 main steps with the data that we compiled. First, we identified lots that meet the baseline soft site criteria under CEQR, and we also separately identified new development regardless of soft site status based on new construction and mergers. If you think of these 2 data sets as a Venn diagram, you have soft sites, you have developed lots, and then in the 3rd step would be the overlap. How many developed lots are also soft sites? And finally, we took a look at several past rezonings and compared their CEQR estimates against actual new construction. Okay, and here are the numbers and how they panned out. So what we saw is that over a course of 10 years, there are approximately 58,000 lots that fit the criteria of soft sites based on lot size and FAR. And then there are 25,000 lots that we, under our definition of development, considered to be developed lots. 1/5 of those developed lots would have fit under the soft site criteria, or 21%. And then finally, for that final review of rezonings, we found that in some cases, CEQR underestimated development, in other cases, it overestimated. And so we'll get into that in a sec with a couple case studies. Our main finding is that there is a lot of variability across the city when it comes to lot size and FAR. The 2 charts here show the distribution of developed lots. On the left is the lot area distribution. So this chart shows that about half of the lots that were developed were smaller than 3,700 square feet. So, compare that to the 5,000 that was the baseline. On the FAR side, things look a little bit more, I think, expected in that the vast majority of lots were vacant. That's the huge spike at the end at 100% available FAR. That means that it's completely unbuilt or underbuilt. The pie charts at the bottom also show the number of developed lots that passed the baseline soft site screening by borough. So in this case, Brooklyn had the lowest pass rate, followed by Manhattan. And this is pretty consistent with the fact that if you think about it, lot sizes tend to be a little bit smaller in those boroughs than others. So that 5,000 really screens out a lot of potential sites. We also found that different lot characteristics were more prevalent in developed lots depending on geography, and some mattered more than others. So, for example, if you look at that bottom row, the second map shows where developed lots tend to be larger in size. That's the pinker it is, the more prevalent in the developed lots the lot size was. And then the third map shows where developed lots tend to be older, and you'll see that in here there isn't as much of a contrast. So this really speaks to the variability of both developed lots citywide and common features shared between lots within a smaller geography. So our overall findings confirm that sticking to the baseline thresholds for the CEQR technical manual leaves a lot of developable lots out of consideration. And to set some of this in context, we took a look at several past neighborhood-wide rezonings that we've grouped into 6 scenarios. I'll run through 3 of the scenarios now, but I welcome you to check out all of them in greater detail in our report. All right, this one might be very familiar. It's a scenario in which rezoning was intended to incentivize development, but CEQR underestimated projections, and we're looking here at downtown Brooklyn. As was the case with LIC a couple years earlier, it was envisioned to spur commercial development amid the uncertainties that followed 9/11. The chart on the right shows how CEQR estimates compare to actual development 10 years after the rezoning in 2013 and to date in 2022. Contrary to expectations, what really skyrocketed in downtown Brooklyn was residential development. And as Elizabeth mentioned in her opening remarks, these are things affect everything from school resources like community resources, like school seats and open space, which in this case have had to play a little bit of catch up to accommodate the influx in the residential population. Next, we have the scenario where the rezoning was to incentivize development, except in this case, CEQR overestimated projections. So what we have here is 125th Street and Lower Concourse, rezonings that were envisioned to spur development and encourage affordable housing production. 10 years in, that would be the middle bar charts in each of these. Actual development had not kept up with estimates. In the charts, you'll see that in the case of Lower Concourse, we did start to see the production of housing in particular tick up in more recent years, thanks to new units that were being produced. Notably, this does appear after that 10-year period that was in the reasonable worst case development framework for CEQR, which is called the build year. So I think unlike underestimates, overestimates it's a little bit of a different problem, but the way we've seen it in our work is that although CEQR is a disclosure process, it can and does inform decision-making often, and especially at the time of the proposal. So in this case, housing fell short of city goals. Our final scenario this evening examines rezonings where mixed-use development was envisioned for major corridors, while residential mid-blocks would retain their lower densities. And for this, we looked at Ozone Park and Williamsbridge-Baychester, very residential, lower density neighborhoods. In these cases, development did occur, but the outcomes were rather different throughout. So on the left, you have Ozone Park. Development was overestimated. Fewer units have been produced in the main corridors than anticipated, but smaller scale development has been happening in the residential mid-blocks. In contrast, in Williamsbridge-Baychester in the Bronx, the number of units produced were underestimated by CEQR. So where do we go from here? Based on our findings, we do believe that CEQR's baseline thresholds have to be updated to reflect historic trends across the city. More specifically, insights into geographic variability across neighborhoods could potentially be applied to the creation of place types or geographic profiles that index or summarize local specific or site-specific profiles. One that I think came out recently that I would point to, maybe not as a complete corollary, but is similar, is the Equitable Development Data Explorer that sort of takes different factors to create a displacement risk index. These tools are, however, only as effective as the resources and proficiency available at the community level. So with the proper resources, community-initiated plans or concepts can strengthen land use applications rather than create a confusing sort of exchange of numbers and, contribute to some of the distrust that can be perceived between communities and decision makers. And finally, these pieces can come together to strengthen a more coordinated and comprehensive growth strategy that includes a built-in mitigation measure for impacts. Okay, so thank you for sticking with me. I know that might have felt like a lot all at once. If you grabbed a copy of our project brief, there's a QR code at the back that'll direct you to the site-by-site homepage, which you can use to also find a link to the full report as well. And now I will introduce my MAS and site-by-site colleague, Suzanne, to demo our web tool.
Thank you, Rana. So I will do a walkthrough of the web tool tonight, which we invite you all to take a look at after and scan the QR code, as Rana mentioned. So to start us off, the site-by-site mapping tool is intended to provide greater insight into site-specific conditions that affect development under rezonings. The web tool itself includes a series of interactive maps examining development at a citywide level from 2012 to 2022. And this was built with purely publicly available data, similar to the look-back analysis that we discussed in the presentation. We iterated this process over time to see what data was most reliable, and we'll show you this evening the information we ultimately included in the web tool for you to explore further. If you're looking to learn more about any of the topics that were discussed this evening, check out the tool's primer on development in New York City, which outlines some of the key concepts that help put some of these findings into the broader context of what shapes development in New York City. So now to get into the interactive map. As you can see here, the first section of the map features an interactive citywide map that highlights all developed sites throughout the city within the 2012 to 2022 time span. As mentioned before, typically if a lot is larger than 5,000 square feet and has substantial available unbuilt floor area, also known as FAR, it is considered a soft site. Look at this map and notice the yellow shading. This represents all of the lots that did not fit the aforementioned CEQR soft site criteria, but were still developed. This makes up about 77% of lots that were developed, meaning all of the yellow here were sites that would not be evaluated for environmental impact. And this floor area is equivalent to about 125 Hudson yards. So when you zoom in on the map, the tool actually allows you to view trends by PUMA, and that's a geographic measure that is similar to neighborhood boundaries, which Rana mentioned. And the sidebar over here on the right breaks it down into development stats per neighborhood. We also invite you to click on the case studies here, which are explored further in the report. And these give examples of both over and under projections of development through CEQR. So next, in the first section, as stated before, the technical manual's criteria screens lots according to size and density. Although site-by-site sets thresholds for soft sites based on lot size and FAR, like we mentioned, our analysis actually showed that the size and bulk of recently developed lots varies widely across all 5 boroughs. And you can use this feature here to see a comparison chart of PUMA's, which shows the percentage of developed lots that did not meet CEQR size and FAR criteria across the boroughs, and we invite you to check out your own neighborhood and learn more about its trends of development. This section also allows you to adjust the parameters, so let's zoom in here. Can find an area, okay, let's see, right here. So you can see that the sliding scales here on the right are set both to the CEQR baseline of 5,000 square feet and 50% available FAR, but let's say that we want to see how many developed sites, which is what's in blue, were actually smaller than 5,000 square feet. In other words, they would not be captured by CEQR guidelines, but were still developed. So let's say now we're at around 2,000 square feet. As you can see here in blue, there are a significant number of soft sites that were less than 5,000 square feet, but were still developed, and this points to the fact that we need to look at developability more holistically. And this type of geographic comparison is very important in creating more informed framework for soft site analysis and land use decisions as a whole. In addition to bulk and size, the technical manual also recommends attributes that affect the likelihood that a site will be developed in the future. These attributes tend to be more interpretive and can vary on a project-by-project basis. For instance, additional factors such as market pressure, population vulnerability, and housing conditions all contribute to displacement risk. So here we can see this is a displacement risk vulnerability chart, and this tool uses data from the city's Equitable Development Data Explorer, which Rana mentioned, to visualize displacement risk indicators across neighborhoods in comparison to the citywide median. And this shows how some of these factors intersect, and we invite you to explore some neighborhoods on here as well. Lastly, section 2B is an example of additional regulatory and zoning factors that play an integral role in city land use decisions and the resulting development. Among these factors are historic districts and coastal zone boundaries and rezonings, and irregularly shaped lots can also affect development due to zoning and design limitations. So these are all factors that can be tied into the lot size and FAR data that we presented earlier to reduce some of the guesswork in projecting future development and growth in the CEQR process and inform more equitable decision-making. So following the panel, as I said before, we have set up a laptop station over here, and we invite you to explore the web tool and ask us any questions. I'm now going to turn it back over to Rana, who will moderate the discussion.
Hello. Okay. Thanks, Suzanne. We've seen this demo before, but it's always kind of exciting to see you zoom in and out and change the map around. Hi, everyone. It's me again. I've worked on this project for so long, I can't seem to leave, like you guys as well, I think. I'd like to introduce our project partners and panelists for the evening. Next to me is Sarah Eichner, designer and cartographer, and our partner at Pratt Savvy. Sarah, alongside her colleague Sarah Hodges, developed the web tool that you just saw. Then we have Tom Devaney, Senior Director of Land Use and Planning at MAS, and my boss, no pressure. And finally, we have Marcel Negret, Senior Planner at the Regional Planning Association. Excited to converse with you all today and also commiserate as we wrap up this project. All right, so starting off with Tom. As we mentioned in the presentation, this work came out of the CEQR Reform Coalition. Can you talk a little about how this collaboration came to be, as well as how the research has evolved over time?
So both RPA and MAS had done, as you and Elizabeth had mentioned, we had done research and reports on CEQR and ULURP. And so we decided to join together and look at a way to explore CEQR in the Taylor 2 rezonings identified how CEQR estimations when development occurs that it wasn't aligned with the estimations, what the unintended consequences are, and RPA Inclusive City talked about ULURP and ways of incorporating more comprehensive planning aspects. So we joined with NYU Greene Center, who has done great research on policy measures for environment and environmental law. So we joined forces, and we initially wanted to look at, we put together a proposal and we got funding from the Neighborhood Trust, which was great. And initially, and I want to say that the project almost goes back 4 years, because we applied for funding back in April of 2019, which seems like a different dimension ago. I also want to mention that we've been working with Sarah for 2 years. This is the first time we met her in person, so this is sort of like a reunion for something we never had in the beginning. But at any rate, so initially what we were poised to do was to look at CEQR and address improving the evaluation criteria so that the impacts, such as residential displacement, can be reduced. And so what we did was we created we wanted to look at how the developability of sites and what makes a site developable. And so we put together a pretty extensive index of built environment factors, but also social vulnerability factors, more health-related, income level. So we developed this index, and the initial idea was at some point we were creating the groundwork for what would be like sort of a predictive land use model where you could create scenarios. But what happened was we realized if we were ever going to do that, we would have to create groundwork by looking back retrospectively at development. And so this leg of the project, because there were 2 different funding periods, so over the last 18 months, our focus has been doing a retrospective analysis citywide. It has never been done at this level before, to get a really good idea of using CEQR methodology to test, to see, all right, this is what the methodology is for deciding what site is developable. And we actually didn't have any preconceived notions of what this research would show. We were talking this morning about how the research could have showed, well, there's nothing really that surprising, but there were a lot of really surprising results. So this was really, we need, in order to step forward, we had to take a look back. And I want to thank Sarah and Pratt for doing such wonderful work with all the technical data sets that we looked at.
Yeah, and speaking of the surprising findings from the report, so for Marcel, we found that there's not only a mismatch between development projections and reality, but there are some really unique circumstances that come with being overestimated or underestimated. Where do you see improved projections informing policymaking in this?
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Rana, and thanks for having me. It's great to see a packed room on a Monday evening, on a rainy evening, and on such a wonky subject matter. So I'm happy to see all of you. I also, before joining RPA, I also used to work at MAS. So Tom here is also my former boss.
No pressure, again.
Ran screaming.
Yeah, I think you did a pretty good job, Rihanna, kind of giving an overview in which the situations in which we saw the CEQR projections being an underestimate or an overestimate. So let me answer that question maybe in two parts. The first one that I would say I think has step a little bit away from environmental review specifically, and more generally regarding to planning as a profession. I feel strongly that one big gap that we have as planners is doing a better job at aligning land use decisions and commitments to capital project delivery and ultimately infrastructure funding. Those two things are not, quite kind of like speaking to each other. And I think more generally, this analysis, the framework, the tool, points at paths forward and how we could start working on a better approach to figure how do we allocate scarce resources, because we can't just throw money everywhere and at everything, right? We have to do a better job at identifying where exactly that future growth and development is going to happen, at what scale, what pace, and be able to then inform our commitments to capital infrastructure to those places that need it most. So I feel like broadly, there's a strong need to better align those two things, and I think this approach generally points to the insights and an approach to better do that too. Just anecdotally, I'm working on a project right now out in Suffolk County in Long Island, where we're taking the insights and the findings from this. Like, we don't have historical Pluto data set. We have to work with like much more limited resources in terms of data, but we're definitely taking the lessons learned from this case to do precisely what I described. We're helping right-size the infrastructure for a new sewer district that the county is planning, and we're looking at a commercial corridor and examining the potential development that might happen there to, align those two things the best way we can. So just generally, I feel there's a lot more potential in application to, this kind of work to the professional in general. And then the other thing that I would highlight is, I think this is also showing how not we can just improve CEQR methodologies specifically, but how we can also streamline the process to an extent. Every time an EIS is written, either by the lead agency or by individual applicant, by a developer, they kind of have to reinvent the wheel and figure all these interpretations of what FAR means, what lot size means, what are the market trends in that specific neighborhood. And like that takes a lot of time and resources from agency staff. And so one thing I think this tool demonstrates, and I'm pretty sure a lot of like the people working on EISs in the future will be consulting this tool to maybe do some of that work and not having to reinvent the wheel. And also, by streamlining the process, the other thing that I would add is, the idea of one of the lines that goes with environmental review is you're supposed to take a hard look, right, of the impacts. And what this is showing is you're taking as hard a look as you can possibly do based on the data that's out there, based on the methodologies that are available to us. And if these insights, these findings are adopted, I think it will make future EISs a lot more robust, a lot more consistent, and less vulnerable to lawsuits. There's a lot of ill-intended lawsuits that happen that are meant to, just like maintain a status quo that we know is not acceptable. And so by doing all these things, I think there's also a streamlining argument that we know that for the current administration is one of a priority, which was outlined in the BLAST report, or the Getting Stuff Built report. Those are a couple of things that I feel like are related to, to the main finding of overestimates and underestimates.
Awesome, thank you. Speaking of streamlining and making things easier for folks, let's talk about the tool. So Sarah, in your work, you frequently collaborated with different organizations to communicate complex information. When you're thinking about a project like this, or conceptualizing a project like the site-by-site one, like what are you thinking about? What came out of this where you were like, wow, this is different, or this is very challenging, or let us pick your brain a little. Tell us what you were thinking.
Well, one of the things that I come to a project like this with is, I know about data and design, but I didn't know anything about CEQR. I came to this with, I needed to learn a lot about it, and we were developing a tool that was supposed to speak to people who are in this profession, but even the people who work in this profession find it complicated. But there was also the goal to speak to people in communities who might want to be able to actually participate in a community board review of one of these review processes. And so keeping that first impression of this present in my mind as we approached developing this tool was important. And so like with any project that I work on, I tend to come to, I need to learn a lot about the topic. And so I spend time reading about it, and especially exploring the data very deeply. And by being involved with the data analysis from the beginning, it helped me really understand how everybody was learning about it. And so finding a kind of narrative in that learning process was a way to kind of think about structuring a tool. And so I think we spent a lot of time talking about, what the tool was going to be as we were doing the analysis. And so I asked a lot of questions, and we had no structure to begin with, except for our exploration of the data. And then after a number of discussions, it was clear that we should be taking people through the same process we would go through, or a planner would go through, or any other, or the city agency to identify which sites should be included in one of these CEQR worst case scenario disaster. I can never remember the acronym. I'm not good with all the acronyms, but anyway, so thinking about like making this incredibly complicated material something that was accessible, I spent a lot of time kind of doing the same thing I do with data, which is to kind of visualize a structure and find a way to create a narrative through it. And that was the CEQR process of identifying soft sites, what might be developed. And so we created a tool that very much uses a process of elimination. And so you asked me to talk about how I handle the complex information. I spent a lot of time trying to think about how to highlight the thing that we were thinking about, which is the material, all of the lots that didn't make it into this. And so there was a consistent focus on eliminating and having the users see how easy it is to remove everything from from an environmental review, even though so much development is happening. I can talk also about like the visual approach, but so much of this was about the data, exploring the data and finding different ways to look at it. Do we look at it on a granular level, or do we aggregate it to polygons of these neighborhoods? And we did a lot of both. But because we were finding more and more that the story in this process is that it varies from neighborhood to neighborhood, and that the circumstances vary from block to block even, that we didn't want to aggregate everything to these large polygons. And so we took an approach that sort of embraced the complexity in a way, but tried to find a structure that gives the user a familiarity with how we're looking at it. So each step has a kind of common structure and a common visual approach, So you can kind of go through this process of elimination, but you're looking at things on a really granular level, but also in a kind of averaged level of the neighborhood. And so that structure was kind of the first part. And I do that with any, project, to sort of look at it in terms of the questions that we're asking and how we arrive at answers. And yeah, this has a very linear process in a way. There's a beginning, middle, and end. You start with the lot size and FAR.
And you did share 2 diagrams with us that we can pull up. Speaking of process.
Yes. So at the beginning we had this historical analysis of '07. That's actually after we worked, that one. So we had the historical data analysis, and we wanted to look at things in the contemporary data so people could see, well, what's going on now in the last 10 years. And we didn't know if we would be putting the historical data onto the website as well. And so I just was looking at all of the possibilities. Well, we could look at it this way with this kind of chart, or, and trying to find some patterns. And then after a couple of discussions, it became clear that we should just be looking at the current data, and it evolved to the next diagram, which is kind of similar to what we're looking at, but that's zoomed in a lot. But yeah. And I think with interactive tools, the interesting problem is how much control do you give a viewer? We could have just put all of the Pluto data up on there, and allowed you to explore all of the different variables. Who owns the lot? How big is it exactly? How many permits have there been taken out on each one? But instead, we tried to really limit the exploration to one question at a time, to control the viewer's passage through the narrative, through the process, so that we wouldn't lose you to the kind of arcane details you can find in this data.
I'm getting flashbacks right now. I'll also add that we did spend a lot of time thinking about the narrative in the web tool itself and how to talk about some of these concepts in a way that really toes that line between you want to make it accessible to people who are curious about this and want to learn more, but also people who are also already familiar and they want to dive right in, and how to find that balance.
Yeah, and that's a tricky line to walk. And we were thinking about people who would come to this without knowing anything about it, though it's probably unlikely someone's going to find their way there. But that's I think a constant challenge with design, is finding that balance of making it friendly and accessible, and I use lots of visual strategies of cues and using a kind of diagrammatic approach that was similar to how we were thinking about the data and the user interface, and sort of common colors for each topic and organizations like that.
All right, so my 4th question for all of you, anyone can start. So research and advocacy obviously doesn't exist in a vacuum, especially when it comes to reforming CEQR or reforming the land use process. Where do you see, and Marcel kind of mentioned this with the Get Stuff Built report, where do you see alignment with other organizations or institutions?
Yeah, I think there's lots of groups out there that will find this quite interesting and useful, the tool in particular. Community-based organizations, I think as Sarah was alluding to, as they're engaging in these planning efforts, and I think we'll find this information quite useful. Hopefully that will shape things for the better. So yeah, and bigger groups that do more citywide research and advocacy on housing and land use. Pratt Center, which is kind of sister organization to Pratt Savvy, is I think one of those that I pops to mind first. But I also say I would add to my earlier comment about how this is showing a path forward to align growth projections with capital commitments. I would argue that there's also a space for Citizens Budget Commission, because they're heavily involved in the budget process. The School Construction Authority, for example, the agencies that have the Department of Design and Construction, agencies that have to do with capital project, hopefully I think there's also an initiative from that end as well.
Yeah, and in addition, I would say, in addition to community groups, similar organizations, is alignment with the decision makers in the city, city agencies, and I think that advocacy works best when you're doing technical work and advancing ideas in this way. We've had great coordination and communication with the Mayor's Office of Environmental Coordination and Department of City Planning. We presented this a couple of weeks ago to City Planning and got really good input. So in addition to the advocacy end of this is that ultimately we would love buy-in from the city. We think we've done really good work, and we have reason to believe that they think we've done good work, and I think there will be there's room for future conversation and advancing. We didn't intend this work to exist in a vacuum, so I think that on both fronts there's a lot of positive things to be gleaned.
And Sarah, you had talked a little bit about, not to put you on the spot, just sort of data transparency work and other sort of things that are happening in more other not-for-profit spaces. If you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I work with Data Through Design, which is an art show that features artworks that all use open data from the city, and that's really, I really enjoy that project because I see so much potential in the fact that the city makes its data open to the public. It gives us, like, we couldn't have done this, couldn't have made this without so much open data. It wasn't just the Pluto tax lots, it was the permits, it was data about tax documents that we looked at to find out where rent stabilized buildings are. And that, to me, it's tremendously empowering. And when people know how to use that data, and obviously lots of people do, and do things with it like MAS and RPA, it's really quite incredible. And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting potential there.
Okay, moment of reflection for us. As we wrap on this project, what has been the most interesting or surprising realization for you?
Easier said than done. Yeah, I mean, as the diagrams that you were showing just a few moments ago, things got complicated very quickly. I remember one of the initial conversations when we were scoping out the next phase of this project, actually with Virla, who used to work at MAS. I think she was the one that first suggested, well, it should be reasonably easy to do an analysis of historical development and compare that against what the CEQR technical manual says. And I said, well, that sounds like, pretty much doable. Maybe you could hire an intern and we'll have something in about a month. And when I started, drafting the scope of work for what eventually became like the guidance for bringing on Pratt Savvy, and trying to like hone in into the details and the methodology and how we would do this, I started to realize, oh crap, this is gonna be a lot more difficult. And indeed, after a year and a half, it proved that it was a lot more difficult. And that's just doing this kind of analysis. Like then I guess bringing it to actual application, that's gonna be like a significant step forward. But yeah, it's a lot harder than.
There was a little bit missed in the planning, building the tool after involved a sort of whole other layer of data analysis that I think was also another more complicated than we might have anticipated. It wasn't just sort of copying the 07 to 17 data, because once we were visualizing it, you could see all sorts of different problems with the data, and it had to be structured wholly differently in order to visualize it and look at it spatially. But sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Just emphasizing, yes, it was really complicated and a lot more than anticipated.
During that period, we would have our weekly meeting, and I would have the scope of work open on my desk to say, are we keeping with this, or are we going off in another direction? It was pretty daunting in the beginning, but we eventually eliminated the things that were liable and stuck with the things that were. So. but it wasn't easy.
Surprises? I'm surprised at how many rent-stabilized buildings there are, and that there's no information about it other than just that there might be a unit in a building. And many other things in the data like that.
I would say what stands out to me is that half of the soft sites that were developed are less than, it was 3,700 square feet out of 58,000 sites. I was very surprised by that. And a lot of them were smaller than that, around 2,000, 2,500 square feet. So it just goes to show you that really small sites get developed, and that if they get developed and they're not evaluated, and a lot of them get developed, that development never gets evaluated in a CEQR analysis.
If I could just add another thought on the same question, but I think relating it to like where there's alignment with other groups on how they could use this. Like when we were scoping this project, the debate around Bushwick and the rezoning there was pretty much out there. And there was an effort being led at the local level from the sponsored by the council members and two community-based organizations, and the intentions and what the city was doing. And yeah, there's always politics and there's always kind of like diversion in terms of policy intent. But one of the things that I was suspecting at that time, and I think throughout this process was validated, is that the methodologies that were used to define soft sites were very much different, comparing what the local effort, the local based planning effort was using and what the city was using. And like that made, those conversations a lot more complicated and difficult than they maybe needed to be, because they're just kind of trying to find consensus on a policy outcome in terms of how much housing could the neighborhood accommodate, but they were using two methodologies that were basically apples to oranges. And that made the conversation a lot more difficult, in my opinion. That was like the perception that I had, and we were digging into this. I think that validated that initial perception.
All right, well, that's all I have for you today. Thank you, everyone, for reflecting with me and answering my questions. I'd like to open it up to the audience now. If you have questions or comments that we can answer. Oh, I see a couple. Okay, great. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this incredible project. I can't wait to try the tool. But I do have a question about the 2022 data. Is this going to be a dynamic tool where you're going to update the data every year?
That is a great question. Well, put it this way: if by chance DCP likes this work enough to incorporate some of it, then maybe they could help update it. This is something that MAS wrestles with a lot in our research work, is that is this information static, and does it need to be updated? And it's a fair amount of work updating the data sets every year, for development. But I think that's to be continued, and we're hoping that in the next couple of months that we have more conversations with city planning and OEC, and that's something that we can maybe come up with together. But it's a great question, and it's something that we have been sort of wrestling with throughout this project.
Sarah's about to run out. She's like, no
Yeah,
more.
Sarah. Yeah.
We do have the code now.
Yes, go ahead.
If we look back 3 or 4 years from now, it seems that we're living in a completely different world. We have, and still have, although it looks like it's ending, we've gone through a pandemic. Thousands and thousands of people have died. We have never expected that immigrants by the thousands would be bussed up from Texas. We've had terrible changes in weather. How do you account for all of that when you're doing this kind of planning, or do you? I mean, they changed so quickly. How do we know what's going to happen in the next 2, 3, or 4 years from now?
Yeah, I'll try to take a stab at that. Yeah, I mean, the question is as I might rephrase it, how are we considering to take other macro factors, including immigration, climate change, the economy, that of course are having an effect on these trends? How are we, and if we are planning to, take that into account into the future? Like, is that like a reasonable way to rephrase your question, right? So, I mean, right now, like the tool itself is very much concerned in documenting local lot characteristics, like specific physical conditions of parcels and lots. But you bring a very relevant point. And I think when we talked about, when Rana was highlighting the recommendations of future steps, future things that could be incorporated, we talk about developing typologies, like neighborhood level typologies. And there's examples in other parts of the country, but also work that the RPA has developed that takes into account those macro factors on immigration, on population growth, the economy, and climate change, and tries to come up with a range of scenarios. Like we don't have a crystal ball, but we can come up with reasonable assumptions around those, and have like a sense of there's a high growth estimate based on high level assumptions, or there's something, on the other end of the spectrum and something in between those things, right? And we have developed those types of typologies, looking at kind of what those trends could mean at the neighborhood level. Now, I think the next step is marrying that type of analysis with this type of approach that is looking at the specific physical conditions of the lots and marrying those two things. I think that is a very strong, that would be like a logical next step in which when you get into that, you will be acknowledging those other larger factors that are at play that are very much affecting development and future growth. But we're not there yet. We need another round of funding to do that. Hopefully we'll get there.
Oh, yes.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have a very kind of technical question about lot size and how you identify these soft sites. So if you have 3, say, 25-foot wide lots under separate ownership, but they're contiguous, is that a soft site under the current, under the current analysis, or it's not? Because that would certainly be a factor, right, in what gets developed if in the right climate.
Well, we looked at that in terms of like transfer of air rights and stuff, but we really took the data as it was. And if it was a separate tax lot, it wouldn't be captured it would not become part of the CEQR review process because it falls under that threshold.
So it's basically tax lot by tax lot,
Yeah.
regardless of ownership.
And that's why we're highlighting this.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
We have time for one more.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Thank you for your presentation. My question is, I'm not a planner every day, so maybe this is a dumb question, but what is kind of the overall sociological impact of CEQR missing a lot of these soft sites or overestimating development? Like, what does that look like kind of every day to the everyday, average person?
Well, one thing, and this goes back to the research that we did in downtown Brooklyn and Long Island City. Granted, that was a slightly different animal because the projections for development were actually for commercial office space rather than residential, although residential was allowed through zoning. So when you have these sort of miscalculations, something, obviously commercial office space is much different than residential development in terms of, for example, schools would probably be the biggest impact in those areas, especially Long Island City, school capacity. If the rezoning doesn't take into account, you're bringing all these new residents in, school-age children, you have to accommodate public schools, accommodate with the new public schools, but if the estimations were for a different type of development or certain or underestimation of development, then those needs are not met. We found in terms of, well, especially in Long Island City and downtown Brooklyn, you have the development that happened was high-end residential. So there wasn't, granted, mandatory inclusionary housing wasn't around at the time, but there's not a lot of opportunity for, or wasn't a lot of opportunity for affordable housing. So it's those kind of socioeconomic factors that come into play. And understand that CEQR is a disclosure process. It's the end of the planning the planning goes on before, and CEQR is disclosing the information. So those things need to be taken account in the planning process to accommodate school children. But if the estimations are off, then those services and those things don't get provided.
If I can add one.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you should also look up some research that the Pratt Center released a number of years ago on this subject. I think that the number of the reports is flawed findings that looks specifically at the looks at the socioeconomic chapter of environmental review, and it offers, I think, a thoughtful critique of that process. Since then, the city has also introduced other kinds of evaluation metrics. The Equitable Development Data Tool, or that kind of analysis, originally known as the Racial Impact Statement reports, and that, I think, was in large reaction to kind of those shortfalls that were identified. So I think some of that has been, improved with that type of information. But to Tom's point, if on the baseline projection and development assumption is inaccurate or not reliable, then that has a ripple effect all across the chapters of environmental review, including socioeconomics.
And residential displacement is a very difficult thing to analyze because, again, CEQR is, you're making assumptions about future development, and there are things that can affect, things that are not foreseen that can affect how development happens. So, in the socioeconomic evaluation, one of the main things that are evaluated is indirect residential displacement. So if you have a neighborhood where economic conditions change such that people can't afford to buy goods and services, people can't afford to live there, that's a huge impact. And I think that this work kind of would, there's no way to 100% predict future development, but I think that this work sets a lot of groundwork for anticipating growth in the future based on actual trends and based on demographic switches. Nothing's ever going to be 100%, but I think this is a good way of streamlining that process. And as Marcel mentioned before, that it takes away a little bit of the guesswork. And I think that can speed up the process and not take every EIS or every project that goes through CEQR as like reinventing the wheel.
I think we're at time. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. Please feel free to come up to us if you have any more. We have 2 workstations set up. You can also use this one if you want to show everyone what you're looking at. And I'll hand it to Elizabeth to wrap us up.